The last thing Daniel Carter carried when he died was not his wedding ring, his driver's license, or the photograph of his wife. It was a small folded piece of paper with another woman's name written across it in blue ink. When Margaret found it, she stared at those 6 letters until her hands began to shake. Evelyn Brooks. She had never heard the name before. If you're watching from somewhere in the world right now, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if you love stories filled with secrets, emotional twists, and truths hiding in plain sight, subscribe and stay with us. Margaret and Daniel had been married for 28 years. They weren't the kind of couple people noticed when they walked into a room. There were no dramatic declarations or expensive vacations. Their life had been built quietly: 2 children, a modest house outside Richmond, Sunday dinners, arguments about bills, and the familiar comfort of knowing exactly how the other person took their coffee. Daniel was 61 when he died. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. He had gone to work early, just as he had every weekday for years. By noon, Margaret received a call from his office. Daniel had collapsed at work. The doctors tried, but his heart gave out before they could stabilize him. Margaret remembered almost nothing about the drive to the hospital. She remembered the fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic, her daughter Anna crying against her shoulder, and the terrible stillness of Daniel beneath the white sheet. For 3 days, Margaret moved through life as if someone had turned down the volume of the world. Then came the funeral arrangements. While sorting Daniel's belongings, Margaret opened the wallet he had carried for years. She expected to find old receipts, his driver's license, perhaps the photograph of their children that had always been tucked behind his cards. Instead, a folded piece of paper slipped onto the table. She opened it. Evelyn Brooks. Under the name was an address. Margaret sat completely still. Her first thought was the simplest, and the most painful. Daniel had been having an affair. For 28 years, Margaret had trusted the man beside her. Now, less than a week after his death, she wondered whether she had ever truly known him. She searched through his wallet again. There was no romantic photograph. No love letter. No second wedding ring. Just the name. That almost made it worse. For the next 2 days, Margaret said nothing to her children. She couldn't bear to put the suspicion into words. Finally, she drove to the address. It was a small blue house on a quiet street. An elderly woman opened the door. She looked at Margaret and immediately went pale. "You're Daniel's wife," the woman whispered. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "You knew my husband?" The woman looked down. "Yes." "What were you to him?" The woman stepped aside. "Please come in." Her name was Evelyn Brooks. She was 73 years old. And before Margaret could ask another question, Evelyn walked to a cabinet and pulled out a photograph. She placed it on the table. Margaret looked down. It was Daniel, but he was much younger, perhaps 23. Beside him stood a young woman Margaret didn't recognize. And between them was a little boy. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Who is the child?" Evelyn took a breath. "My son." Margaret looked at her. "Daniel's son?" Evelyn nodded. "But Daniel only had 2 children." "I know." The room seemed to shrink around Margaret. Evelyn explained that 38 years earlier, Daniel had been engaged to her daughter, Claire. They were young and deeply in love. Claire became pregnant, but before the baby was born, Daniel's father became seriously ill. Daniel left town to care for him and promised Claire he would return. He never did. Not because he stopped loving her. Because, according to Evelyn, Daniel had been told a lie. His father had convinced him that Claire had married another man and wanted nothing more to do with him. Daniel believed it. Years passed. Daniel eventually met Margaret. He married her. And he never told her what had happened. But why? Margaret asked, her voice breaking. Why was your name in his wallet? Evelyn looked toward the photograph. Because I was the only person who knew the truth. Margaret felt anger rising through the grief. You're telling me my husband secretly had another family? No, Evelyn said. I'm telling you he spent 38 years believing his first family wanted nothing to do with him. Then Evelyn revealed the part Daniel had never told Margaret. The little boy in the photograph had grown up. His name was Michael. And 3 years earlier, Michael had been diagnosed with a serious heart condition. Daniel discovered the truth by accident. He learned that Michael was his biological son. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, Daniel met him. Margaret's heart pounded. Did you know? Evelyn shook her head. Daniel was afraid you'd leave him. Margaret looked at the photograph again. So he lied to me. He was ashamed, Evelyn said. But he wasn't ashamed of loving you. He was ashamed that his silence had allowed another man's lie to steal 40 years from his son. Margaret couldn't speak. Evelyn reached into the cabinet again and handed her a sealed envelope. Daniel asked me to give you this if he ever died before he could explain everything himself. Margaret opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter. Daniel's handwriting filled 3 pages. He told Margaret he had loved her every day of their marriage. He admitted that when he discovered Michael, he had been terrified. He didn't know how to tell the woman he loved that before her, there had been a life he had never properly buried. But the letter contained one final truth. Daniel hadn't put Evelyn's name in his wallet because she was his secret lover. He carried it because she was the person who could help him repair the family he had accidentally lost. And Daniel had been working quietly to leave Michael part of his estate. Not millions. Not some hidden fortune. Just enough to help pay for Michael's medical treatment and give him the chance Daniel never had. At the bottom of the letter, Daniel had written, Margaret, if you're reading this, I hope you're angry with me. You have every right to be. But please don't punish Michael for a mistake he didn't make. He lost a father before he ever knew he had one. Margaret cried for a long time. Not because Daniel had betrayed her. Because she finally understood that he had been carrying someone else's secret, his own guilt, and a son's lost childhood in the same wallet where he carried her photograph. Weeks later, Margaret met Michael. He was 40 years old. He looked remarkably like Daniel. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Michael said quietly, I didn't know he loved me. Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. He did, she said. He just learned too late how to say it. Michael cried. So did Margaret. They couldn't get back the years. They couldn't rewrite Daniel's mistakes. But they could choose what happened to the truth after he was gone. Margaret eventually gave Michael the photograph from Evelyn's house. She kept Daniel's letter. And she kept his old wallet. Years later, whenever she opened it, she no longer saw another woman's name as proof of betrayal. She saw the evidence of a man who had made terrible mistakes, carried a secret too long, and spent his final years trying to make one thing right before time ran out. Margaret once believed the worst thing she could discover after her husband's death was that he had loved another woman. What hurt even more was discovering that the truth was far more complicated. Sometimes the secret that breaks your heart isn't the one you feared. Sometimes it's the one that finally explains everything.